Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Oley's 2022 virtual conference, the Home, IV, or Parental Nutrition Medical and Device Management Session. That's a mouthful there, but thank you for joining us again. And I'm Beth Gore. I am the Oley Foundation Executive Director, and I'll be facilitating this session. And I say I'm the Executive Director, and if you didn't join yesterday or haven't heard the announcement, you might be thinking, uh-oh, isn't that Joan Bishop? Well, we made an announcement yesterday that Joan Bishop is now the Executive Director emeritus, and I've stepped into that role as the executive director. We'll be working side by side, hand in hand, continually over the next year, getting up and running. You'll still see her around. She's not going anywhere, just doing less and less of the day-to-day operations of the business. So nice to see you guys here today. Before we get started, if you meant to sign up for the home tube feeding session, please call Kathy at our Oley office. I'll give you the number once, and then it'll be in the chat. That's 518-262-5079, and she'll be able to help you get to the right place. Remember, all presentations from this and both the home tube feeding session are being recorded, and the recordings will be available on our website soon after the conference. And as was said in the introduction yesterday, if you were there, we would love to be meeting in person this year, but at an abundance of caution for the population we serve, the Oley Board of Trustees and Oley staff made the difficult decision to be virtual again this year. But we are grateful to be here, and we recognize that by meeting virtually, some of our members are able to attend who might not have been able to participate in person. Also, in the introduction yesterday, we said the Oley board and staff have been working on securing a date and a location for Oley2023. We are really hoping to be able to meet in person next year. That is our plan. That is our hope. We also hope to have and plan to have at least part of the conference offered virtually, though, for those who cannot attend in person. So stay tuned for the date and location, and we'll be sharing that with you as soon as possible. Many of our presentations today will immediately be followed by live question and answer period. And so please use the Q&A function. It should be below in your bar there to type any questions at any time during the presentations, and we will answer as many questions as possible. I know people like to put it over on the chat, but it's we can see it on the question and answers, so please put it there. In the interest of time, I will be giving only brief introductions of the presenters, but you may learn more about them at oley.org/Oley2022. That's our conference website, and I'll refer to it several times today. And if you need technical support, again, please call Kathy at our office. I mentioned earlier, the number is in the chat. Now, speaking of technical support, as you may have noticed yesterday, we ran into some troubles and issues on our social hours yesterday if you tried to attend. The virtual world we're in, apologies for that. But as a result, we're going to be hosting 2 of them today. We weren't able to host yesterday. So that will be the Meet the Oley Ambassadors and Spouse Connection meetings. That will be this afternoon from 3:30 to 4:30 Eastern Time. Please join us if you're interested to learn more about either of those. Links to both of those groups can be found at oley.org/Oley2022, the conference website, with new links. They're not the same links that we had offered yesterday, so click on those today. We will remind you again at the end of the day. Also, be sure to check out the Marketplace and enter the Marketplace challenges. Links are on the chat or on our conference website. But first thing we're going to do today is we're going to start with our program with some recognition of our corporate partners. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, I'm Rosalind Dahl. As the Communications and Development Director at Oley, it is my pleasure to thank our corporate partners for the generous support they provide for Oley programs. Truly, we would not be here today without their contributions. Many of our partners have been there for Oley for multiple years. Takeda, 9 Meters Biopharma, Gore CVS Specialty Infusion Pharmacy, Abbott, Baxter, Cardinal Health, Fresenius Kabi, Kate Farms, Option Care Health, Optum Infusion Pharmacy, Avanos Medical, Nestle, AMT, Emerita, Moog, NutriShare, Real Food Blends, and Solio Health. We are delighted to acknowledge increased support this year from Vectiv Bio and Zealand Pharma, and to welcome 2 new partners, MedIQ and B. Braun Medical. We'd also like to thank partners for helping us to reach new consumers, providing program ideas, and for speaking at meetings like this one. We'll recognize our corporate partners with a slideshow and a compelling story of thanks by Oley board member and ambassador John Mahalchuk. But first, a brief message from Jackie Henze, head of GI Rare Franchise for Takeda, Oley's titanium partner.
Hi, my name is Jackie Henze, and I'm the Vice President of the GI Rare franchise and new product launches at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. On behalf of Takeda, we are very excited to be taking part in this conference and honored to continue our partnership with the Oley Foundation. We commend Oley's commitment to enriching the lives of those living with home intravenous nutrition and tube feeding through education, advocacy, and networking. At Takeda, our long-standing commitment to the GI community goes back more than 25 years. We focus on improving the lives of those living with gastrointestinal conditions, including those diagnosed with short bowel syndrome or SBS. We strive to support patients and their families along their treatment journey and believe that no condition, no matter how rare, should go unrecognized. In fact, we recently refined our GI Rare franchise team to focus on people who are impacted by GI rare conditions such as SBS and also complex perianal fistulas, which are considered to be one of the worst complications of Crohn's disease. I'm proud to lead this new GI Rare franchise and look forward to continuing our efforts to make a difference in the lives of patients with SBS and those who care for them. In our GI business and across our organization, we view our world through the lens of patient, trust, reputation, and business, in that order. And you, the patient, always comes first, and that guides our decisions and our actions. We're grateful for conferences like these because they offer us invaluable insights into the challenges that you face day to day. And those insights drive our team and give us a sense of purpose in our daily work. We look forward to continuing to strengthen our partnership and learnings from Oley to better support and serve the SBS community. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Hi everyone, my name is John Mahalchek, and on behalf of my fellow Oley members and consumers, I'm honored to be here with you today to say thank you for your generous support of Oley and its programs. So I first stumbled across Oley in 2017. I was in a difficult spot. My health was not doing too well. My mental health was not doing too well. And I was just searching for resources online to help. And one of the links that came up happened to be to Oley. Also found out at the same time that in a couple weeks they were having their annual conference in Connecticut. So I convinced my parents to pack up with about 2 days notice and head off to Connecticut to attend this conference for a group that I really didn't know much about at the time. And let me tell you, that drive was game changing. It was life changing as well. I was around people who understood what was going on. We all had our backpacks on. We didn't have to explain why our pumps are beeping or why we need to take a small break. I was just finally around people who understood what was happening. As soon as I got home, I decided that this was an organization I wanted to continue to volunteer with. So I applied to become an ambassador, and about 6 months later, I was able to start in that role. And it has been amazing, very, very amazing to be able to work with my fellow consumers to improve the quality of care everyone's receiving. Shortly after becoming an ambassador, I learned of some advocacy opportunities that were coming up in this area everyone was calling patient advocacy. I've never heard of that term before, didn't know what it was all about, but as I said before, when to continue to get involved with Olea, I said, we'll figure this out. So I was able to travel down to Washington, D.C. To participate in a coalition of which Olea is a member, where we work with lawmakers on Capitol Hill to improve the quality of care for GI patients across the country. So I was able to go to that, and as I tell the story to everyone else, that's when I got my advocacy bug, got bit by the advocacy bug. And that's something that never would have happened without my without finding Oley when I did. Since then, I truly have embraced working in the patient advocacy world. I enjoy attending medical conferences to talk to other physicians about, keeping the patient front and centered in all care decisions. And all of this, as I said before, would not have been possible without Oley. I go from not knowing anything at all to really growing in this world of patient advocacy, and I credit Oley for all of that. To continue to give back, I recently was also able to join the board of directors for Oley to make sure that patient voices still remain front and center with what we're doing. So now that I've explained why Oley is so special to me, I just wanted to share a couple other stories about interactions I've had with other folks with Oley in the community and so forth. Probably the one that hits home the most is I was attending, it was another one of Oley's annual conferences, and we were sitting around just kind of socializing. This wasn't a formal session or anything like that. And we had someone came up as we were sitting there talking, and they said, I see you guys are all on, either TPN or tube feeds. And they're like, how are you able to stay, involved in everything? And this particular person was told that because they were on tube feeds, they would never be able to leave their house again. So just by, this person seeing us all there, thriving, made a huge difference. One of the final things I want to touch on, and this is really probably the most important of everything that I've mentioned so far today, is, as I'm sure you are all aware, that all of Oley's programs are offered to offered to consumers completely 100% free of charge, whether it be the conference or any of the other resources that they provide, webinars throughout the course of the year, etc. There's absolutely no cost to patients ever. And when I talk to other patients and I start to tell them about Oley, I always really like to mention that, because of our great donor base and our great relationship we have with our corporate sponsors, we're able to offer all these services for patients completely free of charge. And that is something that would not be possible without, all the corporate donations and partnerships, really, that Oley has with industry. So in closing, I want to just say one more time how grateful, I am as an Oley volunteer, but also as a consumer in the broader community, for the generous donations of all of our corporate sponsors and donors. And like I said earlier, nothing that you've heard me talk about today or you've heard other folks talk about would be possible without each and every one of you. And that also includes partnerships that Ole's been able to form with you as well. So with that, thank you so much again for your support of Ole, and I'm very, very grateful. And I look forward to, continuing our relationship going on in the future. Thanks so much, everyone.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you. I'm so glad you're on our board. Your voice is so very important. And thanks for speaking on behalf of consumers. I also want to say thank you to the sponsors. I know personally, when we go in live, when we do it like this and I go click on their website, I get to see new products. I get to find out about things I didn't even know existed. Some of the things I'm not even sure we're going to use right now, but I tuck it in the back of my head. I'm keeping my eye on it because we may need that someday. And so I'm always looking for those things. I also thank you, sponsors, for clinical trials that you put on, because the research is ever needing to be evolved, and also even market research. So if you guys have, as consumers, if you haven't participated in some of those, please do so. If you're able to do that, it really will advance the science going behind this. And I would love to speak really quickly to any advisory or any of our partners that are here, corporate partners. The Olea Industry Advisory Council, it's a perk of being a partner with Ole, and we've reinstituted that just very recently and want to keep that going and going strong. So we want to continue to partner with you, sponsors. We recognize that there are clinical experts within your ranks, and also a lot of times patient advocates in most of these organizations as well. And I want to form a think tank with both of those kind of groups. So send them my way. Let me know how we can better partner together, because it's so important that we keep on innovating. So yesterday, in my announcement, I did a call to action for the consumers, for the clinicians, and also for the corporate partners. We think it's extremely important that the next season of Ole's life, of the next 40 years, we're about to celebrate our 40-year anniversary. And as we do that, we're looking back, but we're also looking forward. Is where do we go from here? How do we continue to stay modern? How do we continue to stay relevant in the next season of Ole's life, to be able to be that patient advocate like John just spoke about? Yesterday, I don't know about you, for those who are able to attend, my head is still spinning with some thoughts, with some questions. And to me, that's the hallmark of really good speakers and topics, because I now think, oh, I don't know that. That makes me curious about the next thing. I've already been making notes on things that I want to hear about next year. And if you've had thoughts of topics or questions or just even general feedback, please let us know. We can put it in the chat, but my direct email is beth.gore@ole.org. I would love your feedback. Please give us thoughts, questions, comments, topics, all those kind of things for next year, so we can make that even better next year. I appreciate everybody attending again today, and we're going to get right into our sessions for this morning. So thank you so much. First, we're going to learn about some of the drug shortages. I know that you have been affected, probably like we have. Our organizations are doing their absolute best to try to mitigate them best as possible, but we are still dealing with drug shortages. So today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Sivan Kinberg and Vanessa Kumpf, who's a PharmD. Dr. Kinberg is an assistant professor of pediatrics in the Division of Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition, and the director of the Pediatric Intestinal Rehabilitation Center at Columbia University Medical Center in New York, New York. Vanessa is a board member, actually, for us, and a nutrition support pharmacy specialist at the Center for Human Nutrition at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Please remember to type any questions that you have for either of these presenters into the question and answer function. Thank you so much. Take it away.
All right, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? I don't.
Vanessa, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay. Well, not now. Can't hear you again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yay.
You
Okay,
made
I
it,
tried
Vanessa.
every button.
Welcome.
What?
You made it to Oley. Welcome. Take it away.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I am going to, so I want to talk about drug shortages and focusing on parental nutrition. And Dr. Kinberg is going to focus on from a physician perspective. I'm going to focus on a pharmacist perspective, but hopefully the focus is really what you can do as a consumer and a caregiver to stay safe, maintain a safe PN formula. That really is our focus. So I have a few disclosures. I'm going to move this over. Okay, a few disclosures noted there. So first I want to start with the background, just a little bit of a background. I really want to be able to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So, and I've already taken up way too much time getting my audio set up. Sorry about that. But really, PN shortages have been around for 4 decades, believe it or not. And many of you are probably quite familiar with situations where there have been shortages in the past. But the reason we're talking about it today is because it's just become more and more of a problem, more and more of an issue impacting more and more products. So it is something we all need to be aware of and how to advocate to make sure we're maintaining a safe formula. The reason that the ingredients in a PN are so vulnerable to shortages, variety of factors, but primarily there's just really a small number of manufacturers. You know, parental nutrition is not, as you know, a common medication. And so there's really only, in some situations, for some ingredients, there's just a single manufacturer. But, you know, there may just be a few manufacturers. And so when a quality issue impacts a manufacturer, maybe a recall or, for example, the Hurricane Maria that destroyed some manufacturing facilities in Puerto Rico, that impacts the rest of the marketplace where it's harder to find an alternative and to make up the increase of demand. The production requirements to manufacture many of these components are very complex, so it takes time to ramp up manufacturing. So those things make it all very vulnerable to shortages, product shortages. I've listed here some.
Sorry, Vanessa, the slides aren't advancing.
Okay.
It was before.
Resume
It's stuck on the
share.
disclosure. There we go.
Okay, yeah. Okay, do you see this one now, the background? Oh, good, thank you.
Now it's good.
So pretty much every ingredient has been impacted. Protein, lipid, electrolytes, really all electrolytes, sodium, potassium, calcium, phosphorus, they have all been impacted by shortages. The trace elements, multi-trace elements have been impacted, as well as the individual trace element components of zinc, copper, selenium. Multivitamins have been impacted. Really one of the first shortages we had to deal with decades ago, and it's still on and off been an issue. So COVID has obviously impacted this, and really why we're seeing increased issues with drug shortages. And when you think about it, not only has there been a shift in manufacturing, you know, you've got the COVID vaccines, the treatment for COVID has all really created a shift in demand for not only things like vials and rubber stoppers and, you know, the aluminum caps within a within a vial, but it's also impacted workforce demands. So there's been a lot of shift of manufacturing due to COVID, as well as the supply chain issues that we all hear about. So those things have definitely impacted drug shortages. So there are strategies available to manage shortages. As I mentioned, it's not a new problem. So we have learned over the years how to manage these shortages or create some strategies. So Aspen provides really good recommendations for this. It's available to clinicians on their website. You don't have to be an Aspen member to access these resources. So it's something to be aware of, that there are resources out there, and we can direct our clinicians to these resources if they're not already familiar with them. Your infusion pharmacy is responsible for monitoring your product supply. So what does this mean? You know, there really needs to be a handle on when supply is running low. We don't want to just run out of product. We want to know, okay, there's a back order of a product. Oh, this shipment did not come in. So we need to have a really close communication within the infusion pharmacy with the inventory and with the pharmacist. So we're all aware of the supply, any potential supply issues. We want to be able to implement rationing measures when the supply is limited. So we want to try to conserve as much as possible, especially for our most vulnerable patients like a neonate. But really, even to decrease a dose may be appropriate as a way to ration supply and really prevent depletion of supply whenever possible. That's really our goal. The other tough thing is to determine, or to really know, okay, now when can we resume normal dosing? It's a hard thing to know, because just because you get a certain shipment, you know, delivered, does that mean it's going to maintain supply? Because you really hate to ration and then go back to normal and then ration again. It's confusing to you as a consumer. So really knowing when to then revert back to normal dosing is not always an easy thing. But your medical team, your infusion pharmacy, and you as a patient are all responsible for dealing with these shortages. You know, identify appropriate alternatives and really make sure everyone is in communication and everybody is aware of what's going on. So what can you do as a patient, as a consumer? There are measures you can take to ensure a safe PN formulation. So that's really the focus and the real take home here. And one of the ways you need to, or one of the ways to help become an advocate for yourself is to learn how to read your PN label. It's really important. And I know it's an intimidating label and not everyone is comfortable with that, but you know, there are key components on that label that it's important for you to know where that is and how to identify those components. So the first thing is to know where, you know, look for the volume. You know, you need to know the volume to infuse and the duration of the infusion. That's all part of the label. That amino acid or the protein dose. Now, it may be a trade name, it may be a Travasol or a Clinisol, so you may not recognize that as the protein source, so you may need to ask your pharmacist, you know, what is this? but that is part of the label. The dextrose dose, which is your carbohydrate source. So that's your calories. Now, lipid is an easy one because yes, it's there on the label, but you have a white bag. It's kind of a giveaway. You know, if it's a white bag, it's got lipid in there. If it's a clear bag, it has no lipid. You may be getting lipid every day. You may be getting lipid 3 days a week. You may not be getting any lipid. You know, that's one of those optional. It will vary based on your prescription. The electrolytes, so those will be listed as a salt within the label. And, you know, so you've got those separate components and then the dose. So that's important because let's say, you know, we've been dealing with a calcium shortage, for example, and if you don't see calcium listed on your label, are you on an alternative calcium? So that's why it's important for you to see what's on the label, because you may have a pharmacy who just, okay, they couldn't get the calcium and they just didn't put it in your bag, but you need to know that it was omitted. The micronutrients would include your vitamins and trace elements, and those components. So those trace elements may be individual trace elements, or they may be part of a multi-trace element package, but so maybe a trade name, but you need to be aware of what's in the bag. And then that expiration date, or what's called a beyond use date, would be also an important component that you need to know where to find that on your label. So this is an example of kind of a sketched out label of what you would see. You know, typically you've got a weight on your label, and where I have an asterisk like amino acids, lipid, multi-trace elements, multivitamins, those are typically ordered or listed as a trade name. So you need to kind of be familiar with those trade names and really kind of look and then compare with each week's delivery. Is there a change? You know, this is, or I anticipate a change. So you can kind of look for that to see if it's changed. But this kind of helps you then become an advocate to know, okay, there's something that looks funny, or I don't understand this. And so then you can call and find out and ask. So learning how to read your PN label allows you to then look for changes or omissions of an ingredient, which is very important to know. Ask your infusion pharmacy if you think something is missing. Make sure your healthcare provider prescribing your PN is aware of any shortages. That whole communication is so important. And I will tell you, from a prescriber perspective, I sometimes find out from my patients that something is missing and I was not contacted as the prescriber. So don't just assume everybody knows. It's, I think, important to make sure everyone is aware. And then finally, and really most important, is there an alternative plan in place? There needs to be some type of an alternative plan, even if it's increased monitoring. You know, what impact does that shortage have on you? And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kinberg. And hopefully your audio will work better for you. Thank you.
Can you hear? Thank you, Vanessa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, success. So I'm just going to share my slides. Oh, I think you have to end your sharing.
Oh,
and then
okay.
Let me take over.
Let's see if I can. Okay, hold on. Well, let me just exit out. Did that work?
No.
No.
You have to, now it did. Okay. There we go. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Looks good.
Yeah, so thank you, Vanessa, for sharing the perspective from a pharmacist. As Vanessa mentioned, we all work together as a team, and you, the consumer, the caregivers, you are part of that team. So I'm hoping to give you some insight from the healthcare provider standpoint. These are my disclosures. So as a healthcare provider, how do we manage the TPN shortage? So first of all, we don't always find out before you do. So sometimes it's actually on social media, some of these shortages, or some of my patients' parents will contact me before I even know that there's a shortage or a component is removed. And part of why this happens is because usually there's a lack of notification to the companies themselves, and things kind of are rushed to try to get things done. Sometimes they forget to let us know. We also work with several different home care companies. This has been compounded recently with the closure of some of the bigger companies that we were using. So there's a lot of care coordination that has to occur. These shortages often happen with multiple products at once, and they're rolling shortages, meaning once one product is out, there's an increase in demand for another one, and then that one becomes out of supply as well. And we have to frequently rewrite the order. So when you have to change one lipid formulation to another, amino acid to another, or make changes to the multivitamins, new orders are needed to be provided to the pharmacist at the home care company in order for us to keep up with the shortage of the week. And you can imagine that that can lead to errors as we're trying to navigate all of these things. So what are we going to ask of you as healthcare providers? So first, when there are shortages, when there are reductions or eliminations of components in the PN, we are going to ask for increased monitoring of blood levels as we're adjusting this PN formulation. So you may have been on a very stable regimen and had blood work done even once every few months or once a month. And now we might need to check things much more frequently, especially those vitamin levels and electrolytes. And we might ask you to take oral supplements, and I'll touch a little bit more about that in a minute. So I just want to give you an overview of the multivitamins. So this is a recent shortage that we had, and it's still ongoing in many places. So you can see over here just a comparison between the adult multivitamin and the pediatric one. So the adult, this is comparing 5 ml. So you can see that the components of the vitamins are much higher in the adult than the pediatric one, except vitamin D and vitamin K, which are higher in the pediatric multivitamin. And just so that you are aware, when we dose the adult multivitamin, it's actually 10 ml of this. So all of these will be doubled. And this is providing you with the fat-soluble vitamins. So these are vitamins that are stored by the body, A, D, E, and K. And then the water-soluble vitamins, which are not stored by the body and are easily excreted. These include the B vitamins as well as vitamin C. So what happens when we are not able to provide the multivitamin that gives you all of these things? So you have an overview here, and I hope you can see this, and I'll go through some of it. So what happens when you don't have these vitamins, and why is it so important that we supplement them? So vitamin A is very important for your eyes. In children, it can, if it's deficient, it can affect growth and development. Vitamin D is very important for bone health. Vitamin E is important for preventing hemolysis, preventing numbness. And vitamin K, when it's deficient, can result in bleeding or bruising. Now, if you happen to be on Coumadin and vitamin K is removed from your PN, that might affect your levels of your INR as well. So how do we supplement? So if we're not able to provide these individually in the PN except for vitamin K, so you can see the ones that I start are the ones that can be given individually when the multivitamin that comes with all of them is on shortage. So we want to give water-soluble forms of these fat-soluble vitamins. When you have short bowel syndrome, you often have fat malabsorption, and this will include malabsorption of these fat-soluble vitamins, the A, D, E, and K. So we can give you a water-soluble version of these. One of the most common ones that we use is the DECA's supplement. They have an essential one, which contains just these 4, and DECA's Plus, which contains a multivitamin as well. Or we might be supplementing the components individually. One thing to note, vitamin D comes in a few different forms. D3 is really the one that we want to use. That is cholecalciferol, that is absorbed much better. There are sublingual forms. One of the brands is called Nutrisource, so they do make a sublingual version. The advantage of having sublingual medications is that we have a blood vessel underneath the tongue. So it's as close as we can get to injecting something into your bloodstream. So it's a dissolvable pill that gets absorbed directly into the bloodstream. And then if you have malabsorption, it's not affected by that. And sunlight is very important. We're often sitting inside. You know, we're not going out to conferences, especially in the last 2.5 years, not socializing the way that we used to. And even when we are in the sun, we're careful about sun protection. So you do want to spend about 15 minutes outside a day if you can, between the hours of 11 and 2. And one fun fact I do want to share, that the way that you can get some vitamin D is actually exposing mushrooms to the sun. So you can keep them by the windowsill, and they can actually absorb the vitamin D, and the plant sterols actually will convert that sunlight into vitamin D, and you can take it in that way. So that's a fun fact of mushrooms, if you can tolerate them. And then looking at the water-soluble vitamins, so I highlighted thiamine. This is really the most important one that you need from all of these. And thiamine deficiency can occur within 7 days to 30 days once it's taken out of the PN. So you really have to make sure that thiamine is being supplemented. And you can see over here that without supplementation, it can lead to confusion, heart failure, and be life-threatening. And you can see an overview here of the other B vitamins. Vitamin C is also very important. This can result in bleeding gums, easy bruising, poor wound healing. So we'll supplement these either with just a complex of B vitamins or oral medications, such as a vitamin C or over-the-counter pill. B12 is another one that can be given as a sublingual pill. So again, when you have short bowel syndrome, especially when you lose that terminal ileum, which is the site of B12 absorption, you can take all the vitamin B that you want orally and it really won't get absorbed because you're missing that part of the intestines. So sublingual is a really nice way to get that in. You can also do IM intramuscular injections of B12. So how do we approach the multivitamin shortage? So we want to really preserve the pediatric multivitamin for young children, especially for neonates. A lower dose of the adult multivitamin can be used for older children, but we really have to be careful when using this in young children. One, as I mentioned before, the adult multivitamin does contain a lot more vitamins, so it might not be appropriate for them. You can dose it as a lower dose, but it can actually be toxic to some ingredients that are in here, including aluminum, polysulfate 80, and propylene glycol. So what do you do if the multivitamin is reduced? You want to make sure you're taking a complete oral multivitamin daily. And complete is really the focus here. You need to understand what that means. It's really listing all of that list of multivitamins that I gave in that previous slide that are in your PN. You really want to make sure that you're taking an oral vitamin that contains all of those, and many don't. The ones that we like to use are Flintstones Complete. So this is a chewable tablet. We use this a lot in children. Decus Plus is another great one. Prenatal multivitamin, so that can actually be used as well. It contains high doses of all of these. Can be used for both men and women. It's a very good multivitamin. Be careful with gummy vitamins. They often don't contain everything and are not complete. And when you do have malabsorption, you might actually need much higher doses of these vitamins, or you might need to divide the dose into twice a day, 3 times a day. To really be able to get to the appropriate level. And if that multivitamin is removed, you really want to make sure you're taking that oral multivitamin again. And if possible, and if they are in supply, make sure that your provider is ordering the individual vitamin components in your TPN. And again, really making sure to get that source of thiamine, very, very important. What about trace element shortages? So zinc, copper, selenium, and chromium can be added as individual components. They do come as part of the multi-trace. There are different varieties of this. And when there is a shortage, you might get one that doesn't include selenium. Selenium really is one that is required, and deficiencies can lead to cardiac problems and muscle weakness. And these can be supplemented with different types of tablets. Iodine deficiency can result in thyroid problems. We want to recommend that you use iodized table salt. It's a really good source of iodine, and there are also potassium iodide drops that you could use that are sublingual. In children, these become quite challenging because a lot of these formulations are either too high of a dose, or they don't taste good, and children won't take them, or they only come in tablets. And there's a difficulty tolerating some of these oral supplements. And then electrolyte shortages. So sodium deficiency can result in seizures, loss of energy. Potassium can result in muscle cramps. Phosphorus can actually be life-threatening if you're deficient. It can affect breathing and heart function. Magnesium and calcium can cause muscle spasms. And a low bicarbonate level can result in metabolic acidosis. And you can see over here on the right some ways to supplement these. Sodium with either salt tablets or again, iodized salt. Potassium comes in potassium tablets or a liquid. Phosphorus comes as a powder together with sodium and potassium. Magnesium comes as tablets. These are sometimes challenging. They can cause diarrhea if you take too much of them. Calcium comes as a tablet or a liquid. Another good source of calcium is actually taking Tums. It can help with some reflux symptoms, but it's also a very good source of calcium. And for low bicarbonate, I really want to draw your attention. So there are prescription versions of this, or sodium bicarbonate tabs. There's liquid Bicitra, and there's good old fashioned baking soda. So I really recommend that everybody have this at home. If you have a low CO2 level, it's a really quick way to make sure that it's corrected and prevent having to come to the hospital. And there are additional shortages that we face. So pretty much every component that is in your TPN has been at a shortage at some point. So mentioning again what Vanessa said, the macronutrients, so that's your dextrose, protein, and fat. These are your source of calories. So if one of these is deficient and we want to continue to give you the same amount of calories, we need to make up for it in another one. So if you have an amino acid shortage and you're not able to replace it with another one, and you're giving just dextrose and fat, that leads to a huge imbalance and it can result in fluid overload, and you need protein, so that can result in malnutrition. So when this happens, we're often able to switch to another amino acid. but it is challenging. Lipid is another one. We recently had shortages of SMOS lipid. That provides you with your essential fatty acids, your omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. If you don't get this, it results in essential fatty acid deficiency. You can see the consequences here. So you can have a dry rash, poor weight gain, increased risk of infection, which none of you want to have, and then impaired neurocognitive or retinal development in children, which again, we really want to try to prevent. And if you're trying to make up for the calories with dextrose, this can result in hyperglycemia or fatty liver disease. So this is a little bit tricky, and actually bothered me quite a bit what people were doing here with the shortages. They were switching to another IV lipid formulation. And some that we used to use, like the traditional lipid formulations, and these kids that have intestinal failure associated liver disease and adults that have it, we really want to try to protect their liver, and a short-term use of one of the omega-6 containing lipids is probably okay, but we really want to try to prevent long-term use of that. And then there are things that you can take orally to supplement those omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. So these include walnut oil, which is a really good source, canola oil or safflower oil. If you have fat malabsorption, sometimes these are not tolerated. So you can actually use these as a medication, meaning that you can do small doses divided throughout the day. You can take it as is. If you have a feeding tube, you can just inject it and flush it, or you can mix it into different food that you're eating. Another one that I put on here, which is actually not a true shortage, but it kind of is behaving like one, is ethanol locks. So ethanol locks have greatly reduced the infection rate in people that have a central line. And this occurred about 2.5 years ago, where the company that makes ethanol locks achieved an FDA approval for cardiac indication. And this resulted in the price of ethanol increasing from $10 a day to about $1,000 a day. And ethanol locks used to be just included as part of your home care package of PN. And most of the home care companies are not able to supply that anymore. And this has resulted in increased risk of central line infections and hospitalizations. So things that we can do, we've been able to find some pharmacies that can actually compound ethanol locks for us. So they take dehydrated ethyl alcohol and can make it into a 70% sterile ethanol lock solution, which can be used. It's actually very cheap to make it this way. A lot of times it is covered by insurances. Even when it's not, there is maybe like a $30 copay for a 2-week supply. So not too bad compared to the risk of being admitted to the hospital and having a line infection. And then there are alternative lock solutions. So one of them we heard about yesterday, sodium bicarbonate locks. They're antibiotic locks, which we try to avoid using on a routine basis because they can result in antibiotic resistance. And then there are kite locks, which are used in Canada, and some centers are able to get them for compassionate use. So what are some of the challenges with oral and enteral supplementation? So one, as I mentioned, if you have short bowel syndrome, if you're not absorbing well, you're not going to absorb these oral supplements well, which is why we have them in your PN. So you are going to have to take larger doses, maybe do it in different forms, such as IV, intramuscular, sublingual forms, try chewable tablets or liquid forms. And every patient is going to be different and have different absorption. And even from time to time, you might have flares of malabsorption, of bacterial overgrowth that might impair your absorption. A lot of these supplements, unfortunately, do have side effects, including diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and abdominal pain, and they're very expensive. We treat them as physicians as a medication. Insurance companies, unfortunately, treat them as over-the-counter supplements and often do not cover them. And that is fine if you're somebody who's just taking some extra, vitamin C just to try to prevent getting sick in the winter, versus somebody who needs 50,000 units of vitamin D a day. That is really going to add up. And then ethanol locks, again, the cost, which we are trying to get the ethanol locks back. I'm not sure if that is actually feasible, though. So going back to what can you do? Again, be aware of those TPN shortages. Make sure you know how to read your PN label. And you can spend time with your pharmacist or your dietitian going through this in detail, making sure you understand all of the components. Let us know if something looks off to you. So we all work as a team. So let us, the pharmacist know, the dietitian, whoever is prescribing it for you. Let them know if something is off or if you have any questions. We have to monitor your blood levels frequently, so there are risks of these vitamin deficiencies. There are also concerns for toxicity. So if you're taking supplements that you bought over the counter, you have to make sure they're appropriate for you and not overdose on vitamin A, for example. That can happen when you take the DECA supplement if you don't need that extra vitamin A. And that can actually cause some liver fibrosis. So really take these oral supplements as directed by your healthcare provider. Make sure that you're compliant with them. If you have challenges with compliance, if taking it 3 times a day, talk to them about what you can do. Maybe you can do a high dose once a day or a different formulation that has better absorption or a higher dose. But really treat it like a medication. The same way if you wouldn't miss your dose of loperamide because you know you're going to have diarrhea, take your oral supplements because you're going to have consequences if you don't. And another important thing to remember, when these shortages are resolved, you have to go back to normal. You don't want to keep taking all of these extra supplements that you might not need. And then working with the FDA. So the FDA can help in getting temporary importation of foreign source medications. They'll do this if there's a critical shortage. And if US manufacturers are unable to resolve the shortage, it does take time to get it imported. It gets held up sometimes in customs, and just shipping it takes time. Shipping by air is more expensive, by sea is cheaper, but it can take a long time to get it. And then advocate. So we are here to help you do this too. And HPN really needs to be recognized as medically necessary and critical to your health and survival. And there's several organizations here, including ASPEN, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Pediatric GI Association, the Pharmacy Association, ASHP, of course, the Oley Foundation, the FDA. Talk to your elected officials and reach out to your media because this can make a difference and increase awareness. So your bowel might be short, but your drugs should not be. Thank you, and we will open it up to questions now.
Thank you, ladies, for that. I'm sitting here asking all sorts of questions in my head. We do have quite a few questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, so I apologize. The ladies will try to answer in the Q&A question section later if we don't get to yours. So one of the questions on here that I thought was very interesting, it says if you can't get lipids and you do still test in a normal range of essential fatty acids, is there still concerns about not getting the lipids, or do you think you're getting it enough from other sources?
So I can take this one. So if you are getting eating by mouth or getting enteral tube feeds, you might be getting enough and absorbing enough. So you might not need that lipid. And not everyone who requires parental support requires lipids. So it's really important just to monitor for essential fatty acid deficiency, make sure that your weight is stable for a child, make sure that they're growing and developing appropriately. Those essential fatty acid profiles are not always the most accurate. That's an issue for another day, but just be aware of that and talk to your provider and just make sure that you really are getting what you're supposed to.
Absolutely. So you keep mentioning, both of you guys mentioned about labs and things. So obviously there's, the macro, the micro, the trace and all that. Are there some general guidelines of how often these should be pulled, especially in the category of during shortage times?
Well, it really depends on the component, the nutrient. I feel like it really needs to be individualized. And just as one caution, I'm going to use calcium as an example because I see this a lot with having this calcium shortage, is that people were monitoring serum calcium levels as a way to assess, well, if the level is normal, then what's the harm by not providing it? And that's erroneous. And, because then it comes at the expense of pulling calcium from your bone in order to maintain this normal serum level of a calcium. So how do you know? I mean, then it's a year down the road. What are you going to check a bone density? I mean, there's no immediate way to monitor that. So yes, we need to monitor labs. The frequency will depend on the component, but don't let that give you a false sense of security that there's no harm, because we can't monitor the impact of all of these nutrients when they're not provided in the PN.
Interesting.
Right. Very important point.
So
I would just like to add one thing. So that's also true for some of the B vitamins. So measurements are pretty useless for those as well, like B2, B3. And some of these tests also cannot be checked at home. So you might not be able to realistically monitor for all of these. And that's why when we know that there's a shortage and we're not able to provide it, just make sure you're supplementing. And some of these you can't overdo it.
So I got lots more questions and they do too, but so this could just turn into a personal session with me and you guys if you want some time, because I've got questions. But is there a more typical way? I know every team is different, but because I have both of you guys on here, like the pharmacist at the DME versus the ordering provider, and who typically leads or directs these conversations more, or is it just totally up to the providers?
Well, I feel that whoever is where the supply is coming from, if it is a DME, which is interesting because there was a question regarding heparin locks. Some of this is pharmaceutical, and some of these are supply items. You know, heparin lock is actually considered a supply item. And the source for some of these, it really depends. But if it's coming from your infusion pharmacy, they really are going to be your point of, you know, bugging them if that's what it takes to keep up with, so that they're keeping up with supply and keeping you updated as well. So there's a lot of times, you know, it is a lot of, you know, you're going to maybe not be the most popular person because you're going to be bugging them about it a lot, but that's what it takes. They need to know that it's important, and they can't just, you know, it can't just be a casual thing whenever we get it back in stock. I mean, I think it takes, I feel it takes the patient, the consumer, the caregiver. You guys have more power than we do as a provider, really, frankly. It really coming from you, especially when it's those supply items, and then finding an appropriate alternative. I feel that it's that end user who's going to be the best advocate, best ability to be the advocate.
Thanks.
Because, right, there's always another option. You could switch pharmacies, right? I mean, that's ultimately in your power, and you can use that card.
Yeah, and we've had that happen where some of these shortages will only affect one of the home care companies and not the other. And we don't like to switch companies, but if we have to ensure your safety, that's definitely something that we can do.
Well, we have time for this one last question. I'd love to hear the answer to this one. And sorry we didn't get to all the other ones, but it's very costly for a company to come back out of a shutdown. The collaboration with the FDA would be really help bring drugs back faster. So how do you see building that relationship between manufacturers, FDA, patient, and so forth going forward?
I think one thing that actually Oley helped with recently is we had an FDA listening session, which was really excellent. I was privileged to participate in that as a clinician, and we got to hear from a lot of patients and caregivers who really shared their experience with the FDA. And they actually told us it was the biggest turnout they've had for one of these sessions. So I think there is interest on their side to learn more about short bowel syndrome and intestinal failure, and to continue to work with us. But they need to be aware of these things and how much it impacts you. And again, that these are not just supplements that we are giving you, that these are really medically necessary components.
You know, there is some legislation out there to try to help mitigate shortages. It's a tough situation. I do feel that, you know, Aspen plays a role there. Obviously, Oley, you know, there is that advocacy in place, but it's, there's no quick, easy answer. And, you know, even trying to import from other countries is not always feasible because everyone, I mean, this is a global issue. These product shortages are impacting it, you know, it's global. So it's not, in the past, we've been able to import, you know, from Canada and from Europe, but that's not even really a feasible solution right now. So but I agree, the government, you know, advocacy is an important part looking forward, because these shortages are not going to go away, and we need to continue to have a voice and make it known that it's a problem, and to do what we can.
Yeah, and the way that it stands now, manufacturers are not even required to let us know how long these shortages are going to go on for and what plans they have in place. So that's another place where the FDA and maybe government can help to push these companies.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Vanessa and Sivan, for spending time with us today and sharing this. And if you can answer a couple of those questions in the Q&A that we weren't able to get to, I hear the theme right there, which is, you know, the patients really need to, the consumers really need to use our voice. And so that's a great transition to the next thing that we're on our schedule today. I'm pleased to now introduce Katie Marschilok. She's an RN MSN, but she's also a retired Army nurse. Today, she's joining us to share her own journey with intestinal failure. It began in 2017. Katie has not succeeded, like several of us, in discovering the cause for her GI motility disorder, but she has learned how to live a full life dependent on home tube feeding, home IV nutrition, or a combination of both. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here today. Let's see. So my journey into intestinal failure started in 2018. And so it's been 4 years now. And I'd say a lot has changed in those 4 years. I think the real challenge in living with any chronic illness is to find a way to live your best, your fullest life with what you have. And I have had some really great examples in my life of people important to me who've been able to do that. First was my children. 2 of them developed type 1 diabetes, and they were already diagnosed with celiac that I'm sure many of you out there can relate to. But then they were diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And my husband and I made it our mission to help them come through life in the best way possible, to really keep their chronic illnesses in their place and help them live healthy lives with it and live the normal lives that children want to live. And I think they very much succeeded in that. They're both in their 40s and have lived long and healthy times with their chronic illnesses. And that's really been one of my inspirations. On any day that I'm feeling a little bit down about myself, I think, look at my kids as an example and do what they did and I'll be okay. And another great example for me is my sister-in-law. Her name is Madeline, and she died within the last year after a 10-year journey with ALS. And it really seemed like the more challenged she got physically, the stronger she got mentally. And she was very inspirational to everyone in her family, as well as people across the country with ALS. She was a wonderful advocate. So again, if I'm feeling having a tough day for myself, I think of these examples in my life, and it's really, really helped me. And I always have had the hope that there's something that could make my situation a little better. And in the beginning of my journey, I really fought to find the reason why my motility disorder, GI motility disorder, happened. And I think in the back of my mind, I thought, if I knew why, then maybe they could fix it. Well, I've moved on from that. And in my world right now, it's so much doesn't matter why. And I realize it probably can't be fixed, but there might be something that can improve it a bit. And even any little improvement is great. And then the other thing is, I really found that my attitude about it is the thing that I can control that can improve it. One of the things that in my year, when my children were diagnosed with diabetes, following that, I drove my nursing career into that direction and became a diabetes educator. And one of my favorite patients from way back when said, well, what you have to do when you deal with a child with diabetes is create a new normal. So here's a little snippet of what my new normal looks like. Part of one of the rooms in my house, of course, is dedicated to my supplies. And then part of me creating a new normal has been, okay, not only do I try to manage my supplies well, but I also try to organize them well and organize them in the way that I can quickly set myself up, create healthy routines, create the real best practices for my daily routines and care to make sure that it's easy, that things are easy to get to. And what you see on the screen on the right is an example of me setting stuff up the night before for the next day, that sort of thing. I get a problem with very low blood sugars if I run TPN overnight and I'm without it during the day. So much of my infusion time is during the day. So when I take it down, I set it up for the next thing. The other thing is to become really expert at it. In the beginning, I remember it being a bit overwhelming. When I started on my home parental nutrition, I arrived home from the hospital after a really rough day, exhausting day. And at the end of it, over 2-week hospitalization, and I was exhausted. And the nurse came, home care nurse came to teach me everything at 6:30 at night. And by the time she left, I was in tears. It was terrible. But it got a little better every day as I worked hard to create this new normal. And the more expert you get, the easier it gets. And Oley can be such a help with that. And actually, for the people with central lines and people keeping all that going, as all of you are out there, the next 2 sessions of this conference today are very much going to be helpful in that. So one of the things I did in my a couple of hospitalizations I've had, and I've used the time to sit and go through all of the old archived Oley conference sessions and educational sessions. And there's so much out there that really can help you. So whatever piece of it you don't feel expert at, go and look for help. It's out there. And then control what you can. Part of me keeping track of my stuff and setting everything up the day before and, trying to make myself the ultimate expert at it is I can't control that I have this issue. I can't control that I need parental nutrition every single day and all of the above, but I can control that I take good care of it and control what you can and really, really feel good about that. But the concept of creating a new normal really helped me. And fortunately, I had the blessing of learning that over 20 years ago from one of the favorite patient families that I dealt with, dealing with their child with a chronic illness. Another choice to make is I've chosen this, and I've gone online and read lots of chat groups and things of people with intestinal failure. And I know for many people, it's very difficult to sit at the table and enjoy a meal with family, friends, and enjoy a holiday meal. And, that's the piece of it that's very, very hard for them. So I kind of early on figured out that for me, I can still kind of enjoy the sights and smells of good food. Now, ironically, the sights and smells of food that I never liked during my eating time of my life still doesn't appeal to me, and I try to stay away from it. But the sights and smells of food that I like is just great to be around. It's okay. And that I can't have it really doesn't bother me, but I don't want to miss what you see here. This is, my husband is the one right across from me. The one in the front of the very front of the screen is one of my brothers. And we're on a trip together and just having a great time. And if I'm not willing to sit at the table at a restaurant or sit at the table at a family event, then I'm missing all the conversation and all the love and camaraderie that's there. So I've really made that choice as part of my new normal I always want a chair at the table. I don't want a plate. I don't want anything else, but I want a chair. And that's very important to me. And I think one of the things that helped me in this endeavor too, to transition in this way is as this was starting up for me, my youngest grandchild was born. And everyone out there who's had a new baby in the house knows that as soon as the parents sit down and put the first forkful to their lips, especially on a holiday, that the baby cries. So that was always my time to have the baby to myself and, give the parents a chance to eat. So that helped my transition, I would say, into I like mealtime again, because that was my special time with the baby. Now he's all grown up and he's 4 years old and I can't do that anymore, but it's just find a little way to make what's difficult for you better. And that's one of the things I did about the table and the eating thing. So one of the big things for me too that's helped me in my coping is to have a goal, have a reach goal, and then really, really go for it. And it takes a lot to get from the slide on the left here. This was the end of February 2019. And, it was a rough hospitalization. And this was all I needed to get through the day was on all those, hanging on that IV pole there. And it was really only about 30 days later that I went from my transition from enteral feeding to parenteral feeding during that hospitalization. But then about 32 days later, I was here. And that was kind of fulfilling one of my husband's bucket list dreams. He's an engineer and he had to see all the wonders of the world. And one of the big ones on his list was the pyramids in Egypt. That trip had been planned 2 years prior, paid for, organized and all of that. And here I was, 32 days earlier, hooked up to all those IVs, and I couldn't imagine going. We had the discussion, you'll go without me, I won't be able to go. No, I won't. Yes, you will, da, da, da. And finally it came to, okay, a couple weeks into it, I figured, well, maybe I can go. And it took a village. It took wonderful support from my infusion company, amazing support and help from my physician, my dietitian, and members of my family, and certainly my husband and our travel companions. But I fortunately was able to make the trip of a lifetime about 32 days after being in the state hooked up to everything. So it was a challenge, but I did it, and I'm so glad I did. And one of the kind of funny things about it was, so who would have thought 32 days after being just initiating on the brand new newbie on parental nutrition that I could be riding a camel in Egypt in front of the pyramids? Who would have thought? But one of the kind of funny things about it, we traveled with 3 other couples. So there were 8 of us all together in our small group as part of the big group. And of the 8 of us, not my husband or myself, but the 6 other people, each one of them had a down day that they had to stay back at the hotel or the cruise ship and not go out and not leave their room/bathroom because of feeling sick in a GI way. And my husband and I sailed through just fine for the whole time. But again, I think in my case, it was, I not only had my parental nutrition, but I had the extra fluids. I didn't eat or drink a thing, and I came through just fine. And my husband, he has celiac disease, and he was ultra careful to not touch or eat anything that was not prepared in a very pristine way. And so he just didn't take any chances out in the community, and he did fine. And many of the days we were there, it was 105 degrees. So even the heat is what brought people down. But me with my extra IV fluids and my physician and dietitian instructions on here's about how much you'll need, da, da, da. It was amazing. So very proud of my husband and myself for that part. And I do think the irony is that we made it better than all our healthier people with us. But when you reach a goal like that, you work hard and you achieve a goal like that, then other goals are easier. And subsequent trips later to Yellowstone Park and other places, many other places we've gone since then, have been easier, much easier. And I view them as not a big deal. And then the other piece of it is even the day-to-day is easier. The getting through the day on a normal week that you're just home doing your normal thing, that's even easier because of what you've achieved. And one of the things that can make it easier, really, is if you ask for help when you need it, and don't be afraid to ask for help, and also accept help that's offered. I am not the kind of person who easily asks for help. I really try to soldier through myself instead. And there are times that I realize I could have, should have, would have asked for help. And here's kind of one of them. The picture on the right is my best friend in life for my whole life. And she noticed that, gee, I get tired with the hiking, the walking, all sorts when we're traveling. And actually, these 2 pictures are on a trip that we took this summer to Germany, Austria, and Hungary. And my friend Denise, if you notice, she has the backpack on, and she's standing right next to me. Now she's carrying my parental nutrition backpack, and it's her idea. Here, I can walk right next to you. Let me carry that for you. oh my gosh, that's heavy. How much does it weigh? It weighs 12 pounds at the beginning of the day, and then it lightens up. And then when I put the new bag on, it's 12 pounds again. So, oh, no, I'll carry it for you. And she just made sure that when we were getting on, getting off, once we, got on or off any transportation mode, that she would grab the bag and walk right next to me step in step. And one of the things we did was we're hiking up along the long thing of stairs to go up to a really high place to see some really neat things. And this is my brother. And who would think that he could so easily walk in step with me? And he did a great job. Now, the irony of it is my husband tries to do that, and he's not quite as good at it as my friend or my brother. But I would not have asked for that help, but it was offered. So I took it, and what a difference. I felt freer. I felt so more easily able to hike up the stairs. And what thing I'm really proud of is my brother is 10 years younger than me. I'm 68, he's 58, and he's a marathon runner. He's in incredible physical shape, and I obviously am not. But he was very impressed with how I could hike up flights and flights of stairs and keep up, and what I could physically do, because he didn't imagine I'd be able to do the things that we did during this trip. So I wouldn't have been able to do that without the help. So you think of something that would make your life a little easier. Swallow your trepidation over asking for help and ask for help. And if someone kind, good person offers help, then take it. It's just a beautiful thing when people offer help that you don't even think you need. So one of the things I've really looked for too, that's helped me tremendously, is I've tried to find gratitude and look for inspiration. And a couple of the real things that have inspired me have been the home parental nutrition pioneers. And I've really enjoyed reading about them. The Dr. Stanley Dutrek, who started the whole concept of parental nutrition, home parental nutrition with the lines and everything. And I had the pleasure of several times meeting Dr. Lynn Howard. And I read about Clarence Oldenburg and together them founding this organization. And really, me being a person who was involved in healthcare and involved in chronic illness organizations, it's unheard of, an organization that everything is absolutely free to the patient, and you can partake of all of the educational opportunities later at your own leisure, at your own time, and everything is free. And to go to the conferences is free. Me going to the conference in Chicago a couple of years ago, shortly after starting the IV nutrition, was life-altering for me, meeting people for the first time, walking the path I walk and learning from them. It's just amazing. And I read in a newsletter the other day, a NutriShare newsletter, about a woman who's been on TPN for 50 years. I mean, that's so inspiring for me. If she can do it, you and I can do it too. And I really am so appreciative of those pioneers. Also, the providers who take care of us. I have the real great fortune of the physician, who's my main GI physician, did a fellowship with Dr. Lynn Howard early in his career. And I'm benefiting from that, fortunately. But my dietitians, my nurses, different people who've taken care of me, and the people who pack my supplies from the home care company too. I mean, the pharmacists, all these people, I have such gratitude for what they do for me and for all of us. And I'm also inspired by them, totally. And one of the things that really became inspirational for me was when I went to the Oley National Conference in Chicago, the last in-person conference before the pandemic. And I saw the groups of little children with their little backpacks, and some of them had the tubing. You could tell they were on enteral nutrition, and some of them you could tell they were on parental nutrition by the way their tubing was coming at where it was emanating from, and that they were just running around, playing and having fun with each other, and just being kids. And it was very reminiscent to me of my children growing up with diabetes. And I did a lot of advocacy work and work on support groups with children's groups. And not only my children, but the other ones I knew over the years. So it just gave me the, wow, these little children just living a life, full life with this. If they can do it, I can do it. So I found them very inspiring. And I have a lot of gratitude too for the people who love me and help me. It's not easy to be around me and love me and help me, I don't think, but fortunately I do have a beautiful family who is that. And the other real inspiring thing for me is this beautiful little girl here is my 6.5-year-old granddaughter. And she developed diabetes when she was 5. So, and when I was in the midst of all this, that's when she developed diabetes. So it's like, wow, I have to be the example for her and of living a full life with what I've got, because she's just a little kid living a full life with what she's got. So I guess the last part of my message is pay it forward, be the best you can be, and be the example for those who follow after you, be it with an illness like you have or with something else. So many of us have something. And I just do feel so lucky that I can strive to be the positive example for my beautiful little granddaughter with diabetes, and that's her dad who has it, and this is the rest of the family. But I do feel fortunate to have Oley in my life, to have in my life who I have. So I wish you all the very, very best, and thanks so much for having me today.
Katie, thank you so much. What an inspirational story. Thank you very much for sharing that today. I don't know if anybody else noticed, but during your talk, I was noticing over on the chat that people were supporting each other in the chat. And I just makes me want to just love this community. People are offering support. That's what Oley is all about. So thank you for joining us today. Our next presentation today is on managing central line complications from Dr. Manpreet Mundi. He is a medical director of clinical nutrition of the Home Enteral Nutrition Program at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, as well as an associate program director of their Home Parental and Enteral Nutrition Program. He's also the science and medical advisor for the Oley Foundation. Thank you so much, Dr. Mundi.
This time I'll be speaking to you about home nutrition, focusing on managing central line associated complications. And really what I'd like to do, if you could bear with me, is start by looking at the history of parental nutrition, some of the definitions, and then go into the training process of home parental nutrition, especially the choice of a catheter, central line, and then go into 3 of the most common complications that we experience with central catheters. Here's my research grants, and again, I don't have any pertinent disclosures for this talk. So let's really start by defining home parental nutrition and more notably intestinal failure. When we talk about patients who need parental nutrition at home, we often say, it's because they have intestinal failure, which is essentially a reduction in GI function below the minimum necessary for the absorption of nutrients, water, and or electrolytes, such that we need intravenous either water, electrolytes, or all of the above, including nutrients as well for health and growth. We can then classify this based on onset, meaning how long we think this need will be. Will it just be short term? Will it be kind of prolonged acute condition, which is lasting weeks to months, or is it something that's going to last months or years, or maybe be something that's permanent. We often look at, well, what's the need based on, why individuals have intestinal failure. So some may have short bowel, right, where the bowel is too short to be able to absorb enough fluids, electrolytes, and nutrients. In many of those cases, it could be lifelong intestinal failure. Other patients may need parenteral nutrition at home due to intestinal fistula, like an enterocutaneous fistula. This may be more limited in that we need to provide nutrition until the bowel can sort of heal and maintain weight, and then the surgeons could take the patient back for surgery and take down that fistula. So again, it's important to look at how long the need will be, but also why they have intestinal failure. One other thing that we often look at also about intestinal failure is how much calories and volume patients need as well. This can also be important to help us in terms of improvement bowel adaptation, because again, we only want to provide parenteral nutrition for as long as the patient needs, and if they're able to meet their nutritional needs through oral intake, we would love to wean off and remove the catheter. So again, bear with me with this, but I'm always fascinated by the history and where we have come, especially when it comes to catheter. And really, you've all seen this slide probably 1,000 times. Really pivotal work showing for the first time in the 60s, that we could provide nutrition, IV hydration, micronutrients through parenteral nutrition, and have, in this case, beagle puppies grow very similar to their counterparts who received oral nutrition, right? Soon afterwards, reports of use of this, in this case, an infant who weighed 5 pounds at birth, but was really born with atresia of the small bowel, and so had no means of being able to meet nutritional needs through oral intake, was given parenteral nutrition, and again was done so with this catheter you could see through the external jugular. That is there, and you can see that there and how big that catheter was at the time. The baby did well on parenteral nutrition. One of the big issues that they were facing at the time was that they also did not have availability of lipids. Intralipid yet wasn't quite as readily available in the US. And so they actually used safflower oil and other oils, but still was developing essential fatty acid deficiency. And so they used fresh plasma from the parents after a fatty meal to kind of provide those essential fatty acids. So just fascinating work. But one of the biggest things was in that infant situation was that at that time, the technique for doing this at home hadn't readily been developed. And so with that, they faced a very difficult situation and eventually withdrew parenteral nutrition. And it was a bit later that you started to see, this concept of home parenteral nutrition start to develop. And a lot of the work was done by different folks. The one I've highlighted here is Dr. Scribner, who was a nephrologist and used some of the same techniques that were being used in dialysis patients. So utilize this AV shunt. You could see that there with this permanent segment of silicone and rubber tubing to be able to allow the patient to receive nighttime feeds. Infusion, in this case, of protein hydrolysate and dextrose solution that's being provided there. in this paper, he also developed some concepts of this portable infusion system. You could see the battery packs and the pumps in itself, and just kind of marvel at how far we have come, especially when it comes to the catheter technique. But really soon after this was described, we started to see other descriptions and development of major centers across the US, North America, even Canada, University of Toronto, starting to develop their home parental nutrition program, starting to train patients on providing parental nutrition. Some of the early lessons, that they described were the use of sterile products, right? Minimizing infections, minimizing those complications, making sure that the entire process was easy for the patients to do at home, starting to look at, what are some of the complications, including hypoglycemia, and how to manage those. So fascinating work and a lot of great publications. But what we started to see was the growth really from, the late 60s, early 70s to the 80s, into the 90s, really the growth of parental nutrition at home. And when Dr. Lynn Howard published her pivotal work in the 90s, she estimated about 40,000 Americans on parental nutrition at home, 157 per million Americans. And you started to see that the indications also started to change, a lot more, cancer and other indications starting to emerge. But what we then started to see was that, the management of parental nutrition by major centers started to decline over the next few decades. And more our DME providers, infusion companies, stepped up and started to manage more and more of the parental nutrition component. So you've seen some of this work. One, the prevalence declined, and I think multiple variables, affecting this, including better management of Crohn's disease, and other diseases. So there's less need for parental nutrition at home. But what we also saw was, again, this big shift to the DME providers managing the parental nutrition, less so at particular centers. And the way we saw this reflected, at least in the data from this study, was who was actually signing the orders for parental nutrition. In the situation where you have major centers, some of those providers are going to be signing parental nutrition for multiple patients on parental nutrition, such as 10, 20, maybe even more. But, when you have situations where the infusion companies are managing, often it falls on the primary care provider to sign the parental nutrition orders. And that's what we're seeing here, that in our data, roughly 6,703 providers signed the parental nutrition orders for 6,778 beneficiaries, almost a 1-to-1 ratio. And so that's a big change as well that occurred over the next few years. So thank you for bearing with me. I think those changes are important because more and more of this is something that you as consumers need to be quite aware of. So with that, I'll kind of shift to what are some of the big components of that HPN training? What goes into getting a patient ready for parental nutrition at home? And really, we know parental nutrition is quite expensive. And so one of the big components is obtaining coverage. Again, when we looked at our 2013 data, about 27% of patients were covered by Medicare, 13% by Medicaid, and then really about 60% by commercial and other insurance coverages. There's been a big shift in Medicare coverage for home parental nutrition, but still requiring this test of permanence, right? That there has to be this permanent impairment of the GI tract so that parental nutrition is needed for a long or indefinite period. You have to document that, or the coverage is often not there as well, right? So once we obtain coverage, we start to have this discussion with the patient and start to take into account the why they need, parental nutrition and really how long they will need it. All of these come into play as we're trying to decide which sort of catheter we are going to place and how all of that is going to be managed, including who's going to be managing the catheter, who's going to be helping with parental nutrition at home, really. And when we talk about catheters, what we're nowadays talking about are either tunneled catheters, ports, as you can see in the middle there, or PICC lines. PICC lines tend to be more commonly used in the hospital setting. Our hospital has a nursing team that can go bedside and place a PICC line, so much more easier to place. Port, tunneled catheter, the tunneled catheters are often placed by our interventional radiology, so patient has to go down to the radiology suite. They're tunneled, so more sedation is necessary, etc., right? So we have to take all of those into account. But as I mentioned, really the key factors are, one, the duration. At least with our program, we've seen, and I'll talk about infections a little bit later, but really with our experience, the Hickman catheters compared to the PICC lines have less infection associated with them. And so our program tends to use more Hickman catheters if we're thinking long term, really somewhere in the 4, 6, 8 week range. There's a gray zone, but with longer term use, we tend to favor the tunneled catheter, right? The other benefit of that tunneled catheter is that it's present in the chest, so both arms are free for the patient to use to be able to connect and disconnect and really manage a lot of the care themselves. Our nurses are incredible about going to see the patient beforehand, making sure that our interventional radiologists place the initial tip in a location where it can be seen by the patient if they look down and look to make sure that there's no infection or other issues that are arising, right? Other factors that we're big on include using the least amount of lumens, right? We often prefer a single lumen Hickman catheter. The more lumens you have, the more sites you have for bacteria to get in and cause infection. So the least amount of lumens that we can get away with, even though this picture shows 2 lumens here, single lumen tunneled catheter is our preferred modality. The other factor that we often consider is, again, patient preference. This is really pertaining to the port versus the Hickman catheter. Some of our patients, they really are hesitant because of cosmetic reason, or perhaps they like to go swimming. So in those situations, they want to be able to provide parental nutrition and de-access the port. Again, if we're accessing and de-accessing on a daily basis, there's risk there, especially of skin breakdown. But if more infrequent access, de-access, some patients just prefer that, right? And then the final consideration, again, is that who's going to be able to take care of the catheter. Most insurance, especially Medicare, will not cover home health unless you have other reasons or maybe have PICC site care that needs to be done, etc. So we also have to take that into consideration. Again, some of the highlights of then, we've got the catheter in place. We train patients on how to care for the catheter, but really a lot of the training is focused on what are the complications that may arise with the use of this catheter, and how do we prevent those? How do we flush? How do we lock, etc.? Right? How do we use the infusion pump? How do we provide vitamins, insulin, disconnect, connect, and make sure we can do all of this safely, right? Then we follow patients, because no matter how good the training is, no matter how well our patients do at home, complications are going to arise. I mean, you have a central line with the tip that's close to the heart. Complications are going to arise, and they can become serious very quickly. So we often check in with the patient soon after they're at home, make sure they're doing well, then a few weeks later, and then really monthly if they're doing well. Same thing with labs. Initially, we check weekly, then we start to shift to bi-weekly, and then really monthly if they're again doing well and we're not making too many changes. And then we tend to see patients on an annual basis at a minimum, but we can see more frequently if needed, right? And in this situation, I'll really just focus on the last half of my talk on the catheter-related complications. And one of the main ones are clots that can occur, right? And these are referred to as central catheter-related venous thrombosis. And so this is any thrombosis that occurs adjacent to that central venous catheter. When we look at the literature, really reporting about a rate of 0.02 to 0.2 per 1,000 catheter days. So this is a good way to look at it, and compare across studies as per catheter days. And the risk factors are there. We have endothelial damage, right? What that means is the inner lining of the vein gets damaged anytime you're putting a catheter through there, right? So the key is, again, not to do too much damage, but this can activate the clotting cascade, etc. Patients may also be hypercoagulable to begin with, right? Malignancy can be a hypercoagulable state. So they also are at risk from the reason they're on parenteral nutrition sometimes. The other risk factor is that there's a restriction of blood flow in the vessel, right? Veins tend to be low pressure state compared to arteries, right? So anytime you have blood flow growing through that vein, it's not at a high pressure state. So if you have this long catheter that's running, you can have more of blood flow slowing down and perhaps, developing a thrombosis there. The other big thing to keep in mind is tip location. And this is something we really emphasize to patients, and we try our best to make sure at a minimum on an annual basis, we're checking the tip locations for our patients. I think this study just sort of highlights this so well. More than 428 patients had 428 catheters, central venous catheters placed in 334 patients. And then what they did was they looked back and said, what was the incidence of thrombosis and how did that relate to the tip location? Again, the key for us always is to have the tip of our catheter as close to the heart as possible. So we call this location the low SVC or the SVC RA junction. That's ideal location for this. So not only, is it from a standpoint of the catheter placement, did it move, etc., but the TPN that we're providing is also very thick. And we use osmoles to kind of define that thickness. So anytime you start to get into TPN formulas that are higher than 800, 900, 1,000 osmoles, you again run that risk of disrupting the blood flow, right? Just imagine you putting syrup into kind of the blood supply there. Blood may start to back up a little bit or not flow as well. And again, that can place a risk. So you want to make sure that the tip where that infusion of the parenteral nutrition is occurring is as close to the heart as possible or in a big vein as possible. And that's what they showed here. You can see that those proximal locate, meaning, away from the heart, they had much, much higher risk of thrombosis than those closer to the heart, right? So that's something to keep in mind as well, right? The next complication that we run into is catheter infection. Again, this is our data, but other groups have also shown very similar data. Despite best efforts by our patients, these catheter infections occur, and we have to know how to appropriately manage them. So this is us doing a retrospective review of our patient population over almost 13-year time frame. This is the number of patients we had, their age, their indications, and the type of catheters used. You can see most of the time, 80% of the time, we're using single lumen Hickman catheters. But again, this will depend on the center. Right over that time, what we saw was 465 infections, and we call these central line associated bloodstream infections in 187 patients. Right, again, a rate of about 0.64 episodes per 1,000 catheter days, right? Other groups have shown very similar data, 0.3 to 0.6. Here's the bacteria that were the cause of those infections. This is what we were able to get out of the cultures. But the key concept here is this concept of catheter salvage. Infection is going to occur. We want to make sure we know how to manage it appropriately. And if we're able to, we want to make sure that we're able to salvage that catheter, meaning we don't want to just have it be removed right away. We want to try, if a patient is hemodynamically stable, not septic, to be able to salvage or treat through that. So I'll show you that here as to our approach. Patient calls in and says that they're febrile. Often we have them go to their local emergency department so they can assess if they're stable. Blood pressure is okay. Clinically they're doing okay. If they are, at that point, we try and obtain blood cultures. We look for metastatic infection, meaning, are we dealing with valve infection? Is it some other tissue that's infected? If all of those are no, we try and obtain blood cultures. We have them start empiric antibiotic therapy. Again, try to be broad spectrum as I've outlined there, and try and give that first dose in the emergency room, especially if they've never gotten that particular antibiotic before. Want to make sure there's no allergic reactions. Then we try to continue this at home if they're discharged from the ER. Oftentimes patients will get admitted and they can be monitored in the hospital. When those cultures come back, that allows us to tailor the antibiotics. We can reduce the spectrum of the antibiotics and pick the ones that bacteria is sensitive to, and then complete treatment. Once the treatment is completed, we can then recheck cultures, make sure they're afebrile, and kind of continue with the normal parental nutrition regimen. Oftentimes patients are admitted to the hospital. In that case, we can often hold parental nutrition until we get cultures back, patient is stable, and then we can start to treat. And then usually in 48 hours of treatment, we see that the cultures start to become negative, and then we can restart parental nutrition in that situation. So those are kind of the keys to management. Again, if we can, we want to make sure that patients don't go to the ER with that line being removed, right away, especially when we're dealing with a tunneled catheter or dealing with a port, especially. Oftentimes we see these removals with PICC lines and have the PICC lines placed on the other side. But again, complication there is, eventually you do run out of access with all of the endothelial damage and other damage that's occurring. So then the other aspect of line infections is really trying to look at prevention. There's primary prevention, meaning someone who started on parental nutrition but has never had an infection. What should we do in that situation to try to prevent an infection from occurring? And then there's secondary prevention, meaning those who've already had an infection, maybe multiple. What do we do in those situations? I'll share with you the ethanol lock data. That's what's been available in the US, as well as antibiotic locks. But in Europe and elsewhere, we also have taurolidine locks as well. This is a derivative of amino acid taurine that prevents microbial adhesion to catheter surfaces and biofilm formation. So this is readily available, and I'm really hoping that with the cost of ethanol locks going up as they have, that we're able to get a product like this available in the US. This is a meta-analysis, again, included multiple randomized controlled trials, over 86,000 catheter days, comparing different heparin lock versus taurolidine locks, and you can see that it dramatically reduces the incidence of line infection with its use. Here's another article. Again, this is in patients on hemodialysis, TPN oncology, showing very similar results. Dramatic reduction in infection, right? So hoping that this becomes available in the US soon. In the meantime, we had been using ethanol locks quite a bit, and we were especially using ethanol lock for secondary prevention in those who previously had an infection or multiple infections. We then decided to do a randomized trial where we use ethanol locks empirically in all patients and compare those to heparin locks. As we were doing the study, we had enrolled 18 patients in the ethanol lock group, 20 in the heparin lock group. You could see the indications there, right? We were kind of marching along. The guidelines from ESPN on intestinal failure were published, and they strongly recommended against using 70% ethanol to prevent, central line associated infections because of their associated systemic toxicity, risk of catheter occlusion and damage. They also recommended instead providing re-education using some of the other catheter locks, such as antibiotic lock, antimicrobial locks, or the taurolidine locks instead. So when we read this, we said, we better analyze some of our data as to what we're finding. And in that interim analysis, now this is always a risk, right? Because, is the study powered enough to be able to detect this difference? But we started to see that there was really no difference in the rate of infection between ethanol lock and the heparin locks. So with this, we said at least for primary infection, it doesn't look like ethanol locks are going to be helpful. Again, this is an interim analysis. We need bigger data. So we've instead shifted focus on using ethanol locks more so for those individuals who've already had an infection. Again, the big issue right now is the cost of these has increased significantly. So we're really using it in patients who have multiple infections. Last topic I'll kind of talk about is catheter damage. This can also occur again over time. And this is just a perfect example of that. One of our HPN patients' husband reported that they had some increased resistance when they were trying to flush. He flushed a little as hard as he could, and the catheter sprung a leak. In this situation, we asked the patient to clamp the line and come in if they're able to. We have been using these repair kits, and have shown the protocol for how to repair the catheter, and cleaning. Here we're describing it being cut and then inserting the repair kit along with this sheath that kind of goes over that location where it's repaired. And then you can see us inserting that adhesion and then finally finishing the repair by securing it and allowing it to sit in place for with a splint. But what we were worried about is, is the repair the way to go? Or should we be replacing this catheter? Again, the big worry here is, with repeated catheter replacements, you start to lose access. You start to lose access in the upper body, then you're really limited with lower body access, or in this case, a translumbar Hickman catheter, as you can see, which is in the back of a patient. Again, much harder for the patient to visualize the tip, get to it, right? Some more help needed. But this access is the lifeline for our patients. And so when I talk about infections, when I talk about damage, thrombosis, we have to do our best to really minimize the complications as well as removal of these catheters as much as we can. And we looked at the difference in repair. Were those repaired catheters leading to increased risk of infection? And we had 55 catheter repairs that we had done, and we looked at before and after rates, and you could see 0.23 per 1,000 catheter days before, and then 0.21 per 1,000 catheter days afterwards. So really no difference in increase in infection rate. What we also saw was that the catheter duration almost doubled, right? Before the repair, on average, and I think this may be the median, we were looking at 895 days of use before. With the repair, we extended it another 685 days. So you can imagine what a big impact that is, almost doubling the duration of its use without it getting repaired. That buys patient more time, and again, hopefully they don't need something like this in the future. So with that, I close and again look forward to your questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much to Dr. Mundi. I'm sitting there listening to this and I'm thinking I'm so grateful that organizations like Mayo and I'm sure others are collecting this kind of data because it's so important to see. Next, we're going to hear from Mary Beth Hovda Davis, MSN, RN, VABC. Mary Beth has 16 years of experience specializing in pediatrics and vascular access. She joins us from Steed Family Children's Hospital in Iowa City, Iowa, also a friend. Please type any questions for Mary Beth, and also she will answer any questions lingering after Dr. Mundi's talk and put them into the question and answer function today. Thank you so much for joining us, Mary Beth.
Hello, it's Mary Beth here. How are you guys? So happy to be here. That last presentation was excellent. All right on par with things that I see daily in my clinical practice. As Beth has mentioned, I am a pediatric vascular access specialist. My first job was in pediatric oncology, but we also admitted all of the GI patients. And so from the very beginning of my nursing career, I specialized in tunneled central catheters, ports, PICCs, etc. From that job, I became a parent educator. And in that role, I really saw best ways to kind of transition out of the hospital into home, what products and needs there are, how confusing it can be to navigate different home health companies that might practice a little different from your institution. So today I've put together a presentation that covers kind of what you should expect, what best practices are, and I want to make sure we save lots of room for questions because I know they're coming up, and I'm completely capable of answering questions for the physician ahead of me and also for myself. Would you guys like me to share my screen for the presentation for my slides, or do you have
Yes,
that?
with that.
Yep, you do it. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Let me just take 1 second to get everything going. Sorry. Here we go. How's that look, everybody?
Perfect.
See it? Thank you. Okay. So there are, as I said, I specialize in pediatrics, but I also consult for adult patients as well, and I'm a hospital-wide resource. So it's been something that I've been doing for quite a long time. But the objectives today are really just to review the best practices as we know them. And I can just tell by the questions in the chat and some of the comments that some of you have a lot of experience, and some of you are newer to kind of managing central lines at home or by yourself. And so we'll cover those and we'll review the best ways to prevent infection. The previous presentation did a great job of highlighting all of the ways that we can do infection, and then talking about the locks, which I appreciated. And then I also like to talk about recognizing when something is wrong or when you need to escalate or ask for more resources, to make sure you feel empowered to ask for those next steps. So a lot of the evidence for managing central line care and maintenance is based in a hospital setting, and there actually isn't a lot of published data of how the bundles should look differently at home. For those of you that are part of a children's hospital, Solutions for Patient Safety is just starting to highlight an ambulatory group to see, like, what does that look like when you're actually in the home. But our CDC guidelines, our national guidelines, a lot of the literature that we follow is based in a hospital setting, and it is a gap. So I'm in a PhD program, and a big focus of my research is going to be looking at what the central line does in the home. But the basics are the same, in that having clean hands immediately prior to accessing any part of the tubing is vital to preventing infections. The line insertion piece is also important, but that's a short part of the line. And then, you know, I've had patients that have had lines for 12, 15 years that take care of them really well. In the hospital, our goal is to remove the line sooner, but as you know, this isn't an option for what we need it for our treatment and care. And so then it really plays into line care maintenance, making sure we're changing at scheduled intervals, and then making sure that the dressing is intact and that the tubing is protected as best it can be. This is the WHO guidelines for hand hygiene. And so obviously there's a hospital bed there, but you have to think of at home when you're running around throughout your day, when you're going to access the sterile tubing of the line or prepare all your meds or get your flushes ready, really washing your hands immediately prior to doing that is key to make sure that you haven't contaminated them in the process of doing the million other things that everyone has to do to get by in their day-to-day. The bundles that are published in the literature are really insertion related, line access related, and dressing change related. So I'm not going to dwell heavily on line insertion, but we'll talk more about the access and the dressing change. The insertion bundle, which the doctor previously mentioned, is that these lines are placed anywhere from an operating room, a procedure suite, and at the patient bedside. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that the patient should be covered head to toe. It's a sterile procedure. We have sterile products. All of that is monitored. Institutions should have processes in place that a second person is watching the insertion to make sure there's no break in sterile technique. And then the sterile field is maintained, and that the inserter is wearing a cap, a sterile gown, and a mask. And so when we're putting the central line for the first place, that there's not a possibility that we are introducing any other bacteria at that time. Now, the access bundle, as I already mentioned, hand hygiene is important for that, for immediately accessing the line. But the goal of the infusion system is that we maintain a closed system. Labeling is important for in-house or for patients or children or family members that might be going in between places, to make sure that across the team it's communicated when things are due to be changed or when they have to be changed. We really do try to cluster or minimize multiple entries into the line, which is why a lot of our home systems are set up so that we kind of have a one-stop shop that we can get everything together. And then this is what is probably the trickiest thing that we deal with in the hospital or outside of the hospital is protecting the tubing from contamination, especially for little kids that have, normal activities that they want to play with the tubing, or if you have, you're going through your day-to-day and you have tubing that's exposed, or you have other drains or other things that might help contaminate your tubing, is to really figure out a way to protect that sterile tubing that's going into the blood to be safe from getting dirty, and then what to do if it does become contaminated, how you can safely clean that with alcohol and change it out as needed. This products, as you probably can all, just validate and explain just as well as I can, is that there's a wide range of products that help minimize infection for the line access piece. We do find value in having alcohol pad or caps on ports that aren't going to be accessed, just to have an extra barrier. We also have alcohol pads, or we have CHG pads, or different kind of products that we can use to disinfect just in time as needed when you're concerned the cap might have come off or been contaminated, or just to do an extra step before you're actually going to get into the tubing. The needleless access connector range of products is vast, and a lot of times it depends on who your DME is and what contracts they have and what pricing they're able to get. Just know that these single-use sterile items should help you maintain a closed system. You should be able to access them easily. You should be able to keep them clean or scrub them easily to prevent infection. You should have enough supplies that if something did go wrong, that you could replace it. I was following up with an infection and found out much later that the mother had only received bare minimum of these caps, and one of the needleless connector caps had become stool contaminated, and she did not have another one to put on, and felt that she just had to do the best she could to clean the one that she had. So that's been a big concern, that like she didn't know she didn't have enough. I didn't know she hadn't been given extra just in case. And so really just feel like you can assess your home products and then have that relationship with your DME to make sure you have the extra supplies when you need them. And if you're not getting where you feel like you should, that's when your medical team can also come and help intervene. And then you also have your tubing and your add-on extensions that are also sterile one-time uses. In this day and age, and I'm speaking for myself at my own hospital, but we're having so many more back orders, shortages in these products, as well as other products that help with home infusion. And so sometimes a sub might be put into place that, I'm not fully aware of, or the family might have questions on how to use it. So just feel free, like if you are getting a product that you're not familiar with, or you don't feel is right, that you ask those questions, because we don't know unless you say something. I see there's a question in the chat about what is CHG. So chlorhexidine gluconate is a cleaning alternative to alcohol. So the 70% isopropyl alcohol, and then we have chlorhexidine gluconate, and they have different efficacies in how they clean and how they clean medical products. So I'll talk a little bit more about CHG when we talk about the dressing changes as well. And we will have time to get back to any additional questions. For our dressing change expectations and bundle is that when we utilize standard dressing kits, so you should have your supplies that are in the kit. That's an easy way for everything to stay sterile, be easy for yourself, or if you have a home nurse assisting, to be able to have the products available in one place that's sterile and easy to open. A lot of times in P's, you also are given smaller products that you have to drop in. So you want to be sure that you have products that are easy to open and drop onto a sterile field without contaminating them. We clean the skin. A standard cleaning agent is called chlorhexidine gluconate. And so that comes in a wand or in a swab stick, and it has a residual activity that can keep the skin and the site clean for several days. So we recommend a week dressing change for those. And typically they'll have a 30-second scrub And I say 3-minute dry time. The official labeling says to wait till dry. I've just found that if I have a set time for a dry period, that the product actually does fully dry. And it's through the drying process that alcohol and these cleaning agents disinfect and kill bacteria, same as if you're cleaning your counter or any sort of cleaning agent. By having that dry time, you're going to kill the bacteria, but also decrease the chance of having some skin irritation. So at my hospital, we say 3 minutes. It can be less than that. We just sort of set a time. The alternate cleaning agent, since the Clorox and gluconate is often paired with alcohol, and some patients don't tolerate it, their skin might react or get irritated, or some institutions choose to have babies less than 2 months not use CHG, is that we call it just kind of the brand name of Betadine, which is the orange swab sticks. So I always say when I'm using it, like I'm painting the patient, painting the child, painting the person. But you start at the center and then scrub your way out. On concentric circles, it comes with 3 sticks. So you repeat that process 3 times, let it dry. And then some institutions may wipe away the excess and some institutions may leave that in place. The dressing, the goal of the dressing is that it is a sterile, transparent dressing. Some of them are border reinforced. Some of them have other reinforcement measures to keep the dressing in place longer. I have found that certain DMEs keep their dressings with one vendor, but if that vendor doesn't work for you, that you're able to swap it. And I have a slide about dressing specifically on the next one. But you also will change the dressing if it is coming up, if it is loose, if it is starting to peel off, because you want to keep that site sterile and occlusive with that dressing. For the Broviacs and the tunneled lines, we often will loop them to keep the tubing up a little bit shorter. And then in one of the pictures that the previous speaker said of having a broken line, we have found that often those lines are breaking at where the skinny part of the catheter meets the fatter part where the clamp is, that's an area that it naturally weakens. And so based on that, we always keep tape on that juncture to prevent that break from eventually happening. But otherwise, the dressing change is typically 7 days. I learned at a conference once that typically we will go 5 to 7 days is how long you should expect a dressing to last. If you're having to change your dressing every day or every other day, that's a concern that you might eventually have more skin irritation, which is something we really want to avoid. So I found this in a Cochrane review. And so there's lots of evidence actually on different types of dressings and what may or may not work, and what may work for one person might not work for the same person. What might work for you might not work for you 5 years from now. So just know that there are lots of different options. And so if you find something that you're not tolerating, it is worth escalating to ask what else you can send, just to try something different. Some people just benefit from having a break from one certain type of adhesive and trying just a different style for a little bit. But ideally, a dressing is going to provide the barrier from microbial colonization and infection and be adequate securement to prevent the line from getting pulled out, whether that's a tunneled or a pick or a port. It's comfortable and non-irritating, easy to use, and cost effective is what a goal is for dressings. And this is just the overall umbrella terms for each type of dressing is that for a while it was gauze and tape. Right? We would just gauze and put tape over it. And then the next iteration was just a standard polyurethane dressing that just was clear, like a clear tape dressing. And I still have some patients that do really well with just that basic level without any sort of border on it. That's the dressing that prevents a lot of their irritation. Then we have highly adhesive polyurethane dressings. Bordered polyurethane dressings that typically will have the cloth border, and I would say that is most standard. There's also some dressings that have chlorhexidine gluconate impregnated either into the plastic or into like a gel pad in the dressing. There's other medication impregnated dressings that may have a silver component to it, hydrocolloid dressings or no dressing at all. So based on that wide range of different types of dressings, you can kind of see that there's a lot of options that you could escalate to one way or the other. I have found we start with a bordered polyurethane dressing. If people are really struggling with that, we make sure, do we need to change a cleaning agent or do we want to alter the dressing? And then we might try a different brand of a bordered polyurethane dressing. If that doesn't work, then we might go back to a standard polyurethane dressing or go a different way too. So it's really kind of like partnering with the family and figuring out what to do. And I see in the chat, there's lots of communication back and forth, and that's totally perfect to share with each other, like what kind of brand names have worked for everybody. And we have found that my hospital, we need to have the whole toolkit. I don't have one, I have a full range of all the dressings because what works for one might not work for someone else. Securement of the dressing is either we have a sutureless securement device, so usually that's a different type of tape that can just like hold the tubing onto the patient's body, so it's not going to pull out at the insertion site. Sutures are also sometimes used, or no general securement. Either if it's tunneled, it often has a cuff, so it's kind of secured in the chest, and then the tape serves as its securement. So as I've already said, there are lots of options. One doesn't always fit all, but I can't stress enough, like just reach out if you just feel like what you have isn't working for you. Because sometimes by the time you get to the point that your skin is irritated and blistered, it's harder to get that reaction back than to try something sooner. And then removal of the dressing is also important. So we request or send home the adhesive remover pads, or there is spray. The spray you can get over the counter, you can get Amazon if you're not able to get it through your DME, but to have a way to gently take tape off that you're not ripping really decreases your medical adhesive related skin injuries, that then when you have to re-clean the site, then your skin can kind of flare up and react to that. So we do try to carefully take a dressing off so we don't contribute to like a future skin injury. Since I'm a pediatric nurse, I have to have this whole section. There's also a broad range of products that are meant to help secure tubing to normalize play and normal behaviors, but also will work for adults too if you just want something kind of out of the way. So just know that there is additional products out there that can assist with securing the tubing and keeping it, like if the tubing gets pulled on, it's not pulling on the dressing, it's pulling on this sort of wrap device. And some of it's adaptive clothing, some of it is like modified wraps and vests and stuff, and then some of it is just a cover up, because sometimes you just want to have like that kind of private and be able to tuck up the pick into your sleeve or something and not have everything hang there. So these are just an example of a few of them, but there's lots of companies that have developed and evolved and come up with solutions. Lastly, I want to just talk about the environment. So it's something we do try to focus on in the hospital a lot, but cleaning the environment or having a secure space for you to work in your home is important. So the body like itself, and if you've been hospitalized, fairly recently, you might have noticed that we're doing more chlorhexidine gluconate, like also products on the skin. And that's meant to kind of decolonize your body that might be picking up more bacteria that's in a hospital setting. There's really no data for use in the home at this time. But why we do it before surgery and in the hospital is really to kind of take a layer of that bioburden off. But there's still some talk of like what to do at home, but really just being clean and having a way to like keep off some of the normal bacteria that lives on your skin. Like we're all covered in different versions of staph. So to be able to wipe that off at some point to stay clean is helpful. I started a timer to like keep me on track, so I'll catch up a little bit here. The environment, just so that you have a place that you're able to set your supplies. So some people go and buy like a new tray or a new cookie sheet, or their hospital gives them like a new Tupperware. That's something that's just a hard surface you can wipe down and keep your supplies in. When Katie presented, she had a bookshelf, full of supplies. So it's kind of hard to find like your space that you can set up things to keep it clean. But just know that your areas that you're touching and walking and interacting the most with, like your phones, etc. It's just a good idea to once a day be able to wipe down your environment, but also have a nice place that you can keep clean. And then part of my PhD program is like better ways to transition the family into the home. and the training that you may need or the training that you want your caregivers to supply. So Katie had mentioned that having people help, you know, it's like if they offer, it's good to have their help, but then it'd be also nice to have like a set way to help train other people to step in and help you better. So I would have to say that there is some research on the best ways to do that. I think it's evolving. I think within the next 5 years, we'll see this really bloom up a lot more. But for intestinal failure, children and families in particular, there was only 7 articles that talked about how you prepare a family to go home and take care of the child in the home setting. I know some studies, especially in the HEMONC population, are talking about ways that are app-based that you can communicate better with your team if you have a concern, if you have a missing product, if you have a concern with your line. So I just wanted to like give a hint of that here, knowing that this isn't fully evolved yet, and I do think it's an area that we just really need to grow. But when you have people, especially for those of you that are parents that have children that are, you know, have lines that other people are caring for, it's just important that anyone who may interact with your child's line or even your line is to make sure they have the adequate amount of training. So whether that's a home nurse that might be coming in to help out, or a family member or caregiver, just know that just having some sort of standard education on the best way to prevent infection is really important and helpful, and can help your team support you better. And then the signs of what can go wrong. So the previous presentation did a good sign of when lines are breaking or when the sites don't look well, or when your dressing isn't adhering as well as it can. Just know that you should feel empowered to reach out and ask those questions if you feel like something isn't right and I don't like how this looks and it's really uncomfortable. What can I do to help? And have the resources to do that. So that's where I will end, and then I'm happy to take questions or keep up with the chat if anybody has something.
I'll start you out with some questions, Mary Beth, first of all. So thank you very much for joining us. I just always love your style, and you just, we've helped each other out over the years many times. I want to start with a couple of questions from that were as a result of Dr. Mundi's talk. So one was, he mentioned best practice is an annual check of the tip. That's not something that ever happened in my life, and he's been online for 12 years. Is that something that we really should be doing? Is that something we should talk to our teams about? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, so honestly, I have found, especially for the tunneled cuff lines, that the tip doesn't migrate greatly unless you have like a big growth. So like the only time I've seen a big tip migration was a kid who had a port, and it was from 3 to 7. He grew enough that the tip wasn't really central, which you would expect, right? But some do wonder, and we've discussed it at my institution, should we just do a quick x-ray, you know, once a year and just make sure the tip's where we expect it to be? And then what's your plan on that? So I wouldn't say it's a formal recommendation, but it's certainly not a bad idea, especially if you've had any line issues, like blood return isn't as optimal as it was before, or if it's flushing a little bit harder, it's always worth to do an x-ray.
That was going to be my next question, is how would we know if the tip wasn't right? So that's 2, it's not flushing right, or it's not drawing blood right. Potentially could be a line tip too.
Typically, if the tip is a little bit too short, it's a higher incidence of getting fibrin. And then the fibrin is harder for you to get a blood return because your like brachiocephalic entrance into your SVC is so much smaller than your SVC that blood can't flow around it as quickly.
So what are some other things that might cause us not to be able to get blood return that we need to check out?
Yep. So basically for blood return it's usually like a suboptimal tip location, but some catheters or some patients just have a higher frequency of getting fibrin, and you can be doing everything perfectly right and you just have a higher frequency of developing fibrin on your catheter. And in those cases, you know, we might look into having the tip be in a slightly different position, or we might be more proactive with giving an alteplase or something that will break down that fibrin. But yeah, what it look like is if it's harder to flush or just not getting as great of a blood return.
All righty. So one of the questions was if most studies are done on central lines, if they're done in short-term line users as opposed to long. Do you know that?
It depends on exactly what they are looking for. So I would say if they're evaluating infection like CLABSI, they pull all the central lines together, and then they can pull out what line types and like duration of lines. So a lot of the studies for PICS are showing that they might have a higher infection rate, but they're also more commonly used in an ICU for a short-term version. So some places, some centers that do home infusion now are collecting their data for home infusion lines, which are typically the tunneled long-term lines, and then reporting that out too. So that's actually really like good data for us to review. But yeah, it's across
Thank
the
you.
board.
Yeah, so thanks for answering these. We got tons of questions coming in. We'll answer as many as we can, and then we'll wrap up here in a little bit. But quite a bit of the comments over on the chat were people talking back about dressings. And one of the things that was brought up is a dressing absolutely necessary? Because one person said they don't always use a dressing, and that became controversial on the chat. So can you address that?
Yeah, so I haven't explored this personally in my clinical practice, but let's say if I had a line, I would consider it more. But the thought is if you have a tunneled cuffed catheter and you know the cuff has adhered into that tunneled track, the recommendation is unclear if you have to have a dressing on. Most places still do, more from securement and not having that cuff get pulled on. But the idea is that the cuff's there, it's blocking off that tunnel track. Bacteria that might enter the tunnel track won't get to the bloodstream because the cuff is blocking it. So for some of our, like I'm a hemonc nurse also, so some of our transplant patients get really bad graft versus host disease, and we may consider not having a dressing, but we clean the site daily, put gauze on, and then our biggest concern is the line coming out.
And
Yeah.
I would ask, who decides if we need a dressing or not? Because best practice still is to use it for most cases. Can you address that? So I'll just go without.
Yeah, so most medical teams will recommend to keep a dressing on. It's hard for you to actually tell if the cuff is really adhered. Like the test is to like yank on it, and I would not suggest doing that. The recommendation has been to have that bordered dressing on. And I'd have to say, even in the last 5 to 10 years, dressings continue to evolve. They keep getting better. You just have to find the right one.
Somebody's asking how often a PIC should be replaced.
So if the PIC is functioning, there's no recommendation to replace it. From the standpoint of vessel preservation, you don't want to replace things routinely. With all of our care maintenance bundles, we should be able to keep a PIC in safely for a long period of time. My record PIC was in for years for a hemophilia patient.
Amazing.
Yeah,
there are things you can keep it there. So somebody pointed out that one word that is used as sterile is the word sterile, like for dressing change things. Is it really that, or is it really antiseptic or aseptic, I should say?
Yeah, so I think the goal, and if you're an OR person, sterile is sterile is sterile. And when I started as a nurse, I was learned aseptic technique, but then we did transition it to use sterile gloves, have a mask, use all sterile supplies. And if you contaminate something, you're expected to replace that with a new sterile device. So I would say for dressing changes, the intent is that the process is sterile. For accessing a line is typically aseptic, no touch technique, which is a little bit different, using sterile supplies and having a clean environment. So I know if those of you that are really savvy, the dialysis world has slightly different variations of dressings for their HD catheters, depending on center. So I'm just saying what our infusion nurse guidelines recommend.
And then Dr. Kinberg on the comment said, it is recommended always to have a dressing of your line, even if it's tunneled, as most lines are. That is the standard recommendation that she's recommending. What I would say is this, is there are sometimes exceptions to the rule, but you can't decide that you're the exception to the rule. This really needs to be a team decision. This needs to be something. I'll give you one really quick example. We were in the hospital one time, Manny, we didn't know that it turned out to be a CHG allergy, and his arm was a mess. And so together, the surgeon, the team, the vascular access team, and us, we came together and we decided, what are we going to do? And we tried a novel concept for a very short period of time, but it wasn't one day I just went, I won't do a dressing today. So if you have like severe mast cell activation, I know that's one of the conversations, it may be worth a conversation with your team, but do not just remove dressings just Just
Well,
on a,
there's a
that's
whole-
not what Mary Beth's saying.
No,
to-
sorry, and I didn't mean to. But there are a whole line of products that are more wound knowledge based that work really well for central lines as well. They're also sterile products. So often wound nurses help make decisions on dressings based on if you really do have a lot of skin injury or irritation, that they are good partners with us also.
Absolutely. So, another question was contact dermatitis for dressing. Do you change it first? What do you change to first? Like their team uses IV 3000 or something like that. What do you go for? What's your first line of defense for contact dermatitis?
When I review the patient or like visualize the patient, if like the center of the skin seems really fine and it's the border, like the edges are what's really starting to be irritated, we would do a dressing intervention first. If it's diffuse, like throughout the whole skin that's had any contact with a cleaning agent, like nurses can't diagnose any sort of allergy or anything, so we can't even diagnose contact dermatitis. We'd want to get, more consults in place, but I would escalate to a different cleaning agent first. If it's diffuse, everything that's touching the dressing seems to be irritated. One, because scrubbing alcohol back over the site will be really painful. I mean, I'm a pediatric person, so you don't want to scrub alcohol into open skin. So we would maybe take a break from chlorhexidine gluconate at that point, just until the skin could heal up, and then make a different decision. And often, sometimes it doesn't last forever. One irritation to one product sometimes just needs some time to recover.
Well, one of the things that I did was a skin patch test. I did my own at home. Like we had started having these allergies, sensitivities, whatever. And so I literally said, okay, what are all the things that are touching his skin? And I took the exact opposite side of the skin and I drew straight lines with these things. And then the next day when there were some that were bright lines, I said, well, let's make sure. And I drew a line in a different spot the other way just to make sure. And I figured, well, he's at least reacting to something. I cut little dressings up in little squares and things like that. A second question is, how urgently does a line need to be replaced if the cuff is exposed?
Oh, that's a good question. Sometimes if the cuff is exposed, it may not be central. I would say that's like kind of a bigger thing, because often the cuff is sent like a ways up into the tunnel tract. So if the cuff is exposed, we're a little worried that the tip is in the right spot, in which case that would have to be changed quickly. But you'd want to
So
have
it's
that
more about anything else.
Yeah, that's what our
Okay.
experience has been. Yeah.
And then how do you manage granulation tissue at the insertion site, like silver nitrate, a new site? What do we do for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we have found, we have tried silver nitrate. I've also just tried silver dressings, like the people have mentioned that in the chat, like a silver dressing that can kind of help the tissue calm down. But if it gets really extensive, granulation tissue can be healthy and oozy at the same time, if that makes sense. Like the type of cells that granulation is lead to more drainage typically. And if we can't control that, it's contributing to the need to change the dressing frequently. We'll do a different site. To minimize once granulation tissue, once the patient's had it and we are switching a site, I really try to secure it well, that the catheter isn't irritating the tunnel constantly, because that can trigger more granulation tissue to grow. That's I haven't found evidence on that. That's just my years of experience dealing with it.
I know you touched very quickly, because you could give 3 days of seminars on infection itself, but I know you touched on it quickly, but are all infections preventable?
So there's a talk in this, in our population that we're talking about right now, it's like the gut. Like the gut is part of our body, right? And the whole idea of translocation of bacteria. And so when we're reviewing an infection that occurred in the home, we tick all the boxes, make sure that nothing was missing, everyone had the right supplies. But sometimes it's like a gastric event happens, and then the concept is that bacteria may move from the gut into the bloodstream since they're so close together. But that's where the locks and those type of technologies, I think, really help in preventing that. At least that's my institutional theory on it. But yeah, the whole MBI injury and gut translocation doesn't preclude the need to also make sure that we're doing the best in our care maintenance to prevent infection that way too. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we have all the answers for that yet.
I think more research needs to be done on all sorts of things. This population has been asking some amazing questions today and yesterday, and the answer is we don't know all of these things right now. Keep yourself safe in the meantime. So I have one last question for you: is we're trying to have a conference live next year. Your people are saying how great you're doing here, so maybe you can come and join us live next year. Maybe.
Yeah, and hopefully next year I'll have a lot of my dissertation research done, which is evaluating what families are doing in the home and what gaps we have in supporting families. Yeah. So
Well, if you need any other people, contact us. We have a few thousand people living on PN, so let us know. But if you could also finish answering up some of those Q&As if you have a chance. If not, I can send them to you later because there's some over on the side and then in the Q&A. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mary Beth.
Yep. Thanks so much.
And as we wrap up today, it says my internet's unstable. I don't know if you can hear me or not well, but please check out the marketplace and take the 3 challenges. Consumers and caregivers 18 and older who score at least 80% correctly will be entered in the drawing, and 5 lucky winners will be offered their choice of great prizes. Clinicians, you guys are also welcome to take the challenges for fun learning experience. The links are at Oley.org/marketplace2022, and a copy of the link is in the chat. Also, you must complete the challenges by 12:30 Eastern tomorrow to be entered in the drawing, and winners will be announced at the closing remarks tomorrow afternoon. And again, we ask you to please complete the conference evaluation. Your feedback is so important to us on what we do for next year. And you'll get an email from Zoom with a link to the short survey. And then if you're using Zoom through the web browser, you should be getting a prompt on the Zoom screen with a link to the survey. And I want to remind you that there's a couple of social hours this afternoon. You can go to our main website to get that. It's also in the chat. Roz has just put that up on the chat, but that's going to disappear in a few minutes here. If you want those links, you can also go to our conference website, which is Oley.org/Oley2022. So join us tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern for another full day of information and connections, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, guys.